So let me shift to the pedagogical, but I'm reminded of one other key development before I do. As I've said, the tests begin to sort of shape and did have a huge influence on what was taught. They also influenced the theories that were being built. If you think about it in terms of the model of reading comprehension up and through the 50s, it was very much tied to research that was done using multiple regression techniques or correlation techniques, correlating subtests with overall measures of achievement. And predictably, I think what you found was vocabulary was an incredible predictor of reading ability, and it sort of, in a sense, propelled and added momentum to models that sort of were built upon how vocabulary was a major factor in reading. And those things I don't think were really challenged until we broke away from those theories and began to develop other measures. But as I've talked about it, in the 50s we saw the explosion of concern about schools, why Johnny can't read, and people looking at test performance of kids and basically lamenting the failure of education. Indeed, I think their concerns were quite unwarranted. One of the studies that I was fascinated by at this point in time was a study done by some reading educators at Indiana University, Roger Farr and some of his colleagues, and it was called Reading Achievement Then and Now. And what he did was actually take the tests of past years, administer those tests to students of that day, together with tests that were being used for that day. And his argument was that the tests have changed, the norms have changed, and indeed, while it may appear that kids aren't improving in terms of their reading, they're actually probably would have done better on the tests that were being used in the past. He certainly found that sort of stuff and was a solid evidence for refuting the claims. But nonetheless, the politics were highlighting a lot of concern about education and a need to really deal with what are the best methods of teaching reading, and beginning to come up with tests that were going to have more of a direct influence upon teaching. One of the major developments was the development of criterion reference test. Tests that were clearly connected with the curriculum at the level of the skills that were being taught or the sub-skills. And predominantly the curriculum at that point in time was an array of skills in the area of word recognition, comprehension, study skills, and maybe literary appreciations and critical reading skills. And so the concept of criterion referencing would map out these skills, the scope and sequence across the grades, and samples of what kids would be expected to learn in very much a hierarchical mastery sort of fashion, whereby they would develop test items that would focus upon whether or not students were actually able to respond to items purported to be testing these sub-skills. And so criterion reference testing involved the development of large masses of tests and the generation of information as to whether or not students were at a mastery level or needed help learning those skills. When you think about it, you can start to sort of see, wow, what an incredible system for testing kids. But if in fact the tests begin to be the deciding factor in terms of how things are taught, you can sort of see how reductionistic and how mechanistic the approach to reading education that these tests might propel. The Wisconsin Design was a federally funded effort of criterion reference testing in reading, which developed those sorts of materials. These days there are lots of examples of this sort of attempt to develop criterion reference testing and making sure students are responding to the types of things that are being tested. And where this sort of cycle of testing kids to see where they are, teaching kids to the level of mastery, all assuming that reading sort of develops in that sort of systematic developmental fashion, which I have questions about, en route to testing the child again to see if he or she has mastered it. Another development related to this emphasis on pedagogy was an approach to reading which fitted very much in with the curriculum. Again, tied to this scope and sequence model of reading, integral to the programs were certainly the sub-skills, the word rate, the comprehension, and so on. But also was an approach to reading which engaged kids in being presented with a diet of reading material that was graded, and the use of readability formulas which had grown over this period contributed to this, such that kids in the first grade would be given material that was designated first grade level, and third graders would be given material designated third grade level. And the teachers would be engaging their students in a diet of these materials, a diet of materials where they, if you go back to the regimen defined largely by the tests, they'd be taught some vocabulary, they'd be reading short portions and be given questions, and then they'd be given sub-skills development. But the concept was, well, what we also needed, apart from these criterion referencings, which would help us with the skill teaching, we also needed ways to place students. And oftentimes the norm reference approach wasn't that successful because it just might not be as accurate as actually trying out whether or not a student could handle material at the grade level. And so what we saw develop was informal placement techniques. And predictably, those informal placement techniques involved having the student read orally, or having the student read silently or out loud, and then respond to questions. Where a criterion was suggested, which is largely seat of the pants by educators who thought they had a sense of what would be an appropriate level of accuracy relative to oral reading or level of accuracy relative to comprehension. The placement level, there was sort of what they used to call a 5-finger rule. The expectation for a child to be able to handle material at that level, that he should be able to orally read accurately 90 to 95% of the words and respond to a subset of questions which would include main idea and inferential questions and detailed questions with about 75% accuracy. And that this would give you a sort of sense of the highest level of material at which he could or she could respond at this level. This would be considered to be the person's grade level. It sort of assumes so much about how reading develops, which I think can be challenged. Another technique that was similar to this, which was developed around the same time, was an approach called the close procedure. And as the name implies, here the student was to actually complete a passage from which certain words were deleted, sometimes every 5th word, sometimes every 7th word. And whether or not the child could do this accurately was a determiner of whether or not the student could handle this material. The close technique had the advantage of being able to be administered in a group fashion. The informal re-inventory or the informal placement techniques had the limitation, but also the advantage in some sense of being individual techniques. What's interesting, as I entered the field, these things were quite commonplace, and one study that I was involved in decided to look at the comprehension criteria to see how viable that was. And so we developed, myself and 2 colleagues, Joe Peters and Ed Parry, developed sets of questions for the same passage. And what we discovered was it depended upon the set of questions what grade level. In other words, some kids, depending upon what set of questions they were given, might be 2 grade levels ahead of based upon one set of question versus another set of questions. And so the fallibility of this was a concern, particularly if in fact the teacher used it in a sort of a hard-nosed sort of fashion.